This is our Halloween episode. Though I must admit, I hate the idea of a Halloween episode or a Christmas episode. For some reason, the whole idea of a holiday-themed episode just takes me out of things. Regardless, the holiday in question is a good excuse to go into Mark Fisher's The Weird and the Eerie. I also want to take this moment to say thank you to all of the new patrons. We have now officially surpassed 100 and counting. If you aren't supporting yet, why don't you hop on until the end of the year? That's only $2. And we have t-shirts too at critdrip.com. The website for the merch will be in the show notes. Also, keep an eye out for a giveaway that Acid Horizon will conduct in the month of November. Okay, on to the show. Welcome to Acid Horizon, the Theory Podcast. Today on the show, we have Matt Colquhoun with us again to talk about Mark Fisher's The Weird and the Eerie. This was appropriate given the season. Matt is the author of Egress, and he is also the editor of a series of Mark Fisher's lectures that were previously unpublished entitled Postcapitalist Desire by Repeater Books. Thanks for coming on the show as usual, Matt.
Yeah, pleasure to be here again. It's lovely to hang out with you guys on Halloween Eve.
It got Easter.
Exactly.
Also on the show, we have Adam and Will. Today, we are talking about Mark Fisher's The Weird and the Eerie. And what we thought we would do is highlight the concept of the weird and the eerie. Mark Fisher's notion of strangeness, how is it different than, for example, Freud's notion of the uncanny? We're going to get into that. And then we're going to spotlight various parts of the book that interested us and maybe connect it to things that we're working on or experiences that we had ourselves that are weird and eerie. So, Matt, maybe we can start the episode off by you talking to us about the concept of the weird as Mark Fisher renders it within The Weird and the Eerie.
Yeah, maybe this is also the curse of being me, but I struggle to actually keep this book sort of self-contained because I feel like it's so it's such an odd one for Fisher in that it's very self-contained, or it's very implicit, and it's maybe Fisher that is maybe his least didactic. But the weird, especially, I can't help but think of as like a really key concept for understanding capitalist realism. And I think that Mark defines it as the weird is that which does not belong, but as a kind of aesthetic category, as an innately alienating aesthetic category. I think it's something that we can't help within the context of Mark's writings, and more generally, maybe we can't help but think about in relation to capitalism, and especially that sense of what Mark called the confabulated consistency of capitalism's sense of itself as a total perfect sphere, almost without blemishes, and the weird sort of becomes that experience, a bit like Neo in the Matrix, where he has a bit of deja vu. If you have deja vu in the Matrix, it's a sign that they've changed something. And then maybe if the weird in real life is a sign that capitalism has for a moment failed to keep up with its own illusion.
Yeah, the thing that I really liked in the beginning is how Mark turns the notion of doubling on its head. And he's using the example of Freud. So just to go into the text for a moment, Fisher draws a distinction between the notion of strangeness in Freud's concept of the uncanny with his own in the concept of the weird, as he puts it. And you're going to see a pretty familiar move here and that you'll see in theorists like Deleuze and Guattari and so forth. So in Freud, there's the uncanniness of doubles, such as in the Uncanny Valley, where multiplicities or doubling create this unsettling effect depending on the proximity at which you are from those multiplicities and or those doubles. And one of the things that comes to mind is the plateau in 1,000 Plateaus, One or Several Wolves, where in that particular plateau, he mentions the falling out that Jung had with Freud about the dream of the skulls, where Jung was interested in, like, what is the meaning of the appearance of a multiplicity in a dream? And Freud wanted to immediately reduce that to a singular symbolic image of the skull. And then which raises the question, the notion of representation, which will take us down the Deleuze and Guattari path, which we don't need to do right away. But what Fisher says is actually what a better definition of Freud's concept of uncanny is the idea of being unheimlich, or the unhomely, which is that this notion of the domestic doesn't coincide with itself. That's what Mark says in the book, that the idea that the strange has this incommensurability between itself and the domestic. And there's always a sort of like quasi-normative dimension to the strange and the notion of the doubling. And there's two ways that we can go with it. We can go the Freud route. We can go this uncanny route. But there's this also this notion of the weird, which is the concept of seeing the inside from the outside. So rather than trying to draw in or reduce that which is outside to the sense of the inside, the weird puts us on the outside. And now we can occupy the outside from what was once a subordinate position in psychoanalysis, now to rupture the dominant center of the inside. There's also a notion of pairing here, but not as doubling, but a kind of conjoining, like you said, of things just that don't belong with one another.
Yeah, I think that the concept of the weird is much more forceful in a very sort of Deleuze and Guattari kind of way than the Freudian unheimlich, because the unheimlich is defined, in terms of the home, in terms of the unfamiliar, and in the way that the Freudian project is to examine the unfamiliar, the unheimlich, in a way that shows as an alienated kind of familiarity. It is already brought within the familiar, and as Deleuze and Guattari would then put it, as Fisher does, the familial. And there's a kind of anti-Oedipism to the concept of the weird, because rather than put it in this, what seems like an immediately dialectical relationship where the outsideness of the unfamiliar is recuperated, here the dialectical relationship between the weird and the regular is a sort of weird that challenges the very categories in which you try to comprehend it. You can't simply rehabilitate it into the familiar, because the very presence of this weird thing in this familiar landscape shows that the familiar landscape was never really familiar or properly encapsulating of reality as we saw it. It is this gateway to another world which escapes a sort of a dialectical recuperation.
The weird and the eerie both share one thing, and it's that they orient themselves around presence, right? And that term, right, has a sort of phenomenological heaviness to it that we have to contend with. One particular quote right out of the gates in The Weird and the Eerie that I love, that when I opened up this book for the first time after unpacking it from a box, is on page 11. Capital is at every level an eerie entity, conjured out of nothing. Capital nevertheless exerts more influence than any allegedly substantial entity. So if we understand the eerie as something that is either present that should not be, or something that is fundamentally lacking, we can then start to sort of break down the way in which Fisher is going to move forward in his literature review in this text, and where he's going to sort of demarcate the confines within which the weird and the eerie separate.
Just sort of take us back, actually, just to sort of more of the context of this book. I was wondering, Matt, one of you could tell us about sort of where the weird and the eerie is situated in terms of where Mark was in his career at this point, and sort of what this was coming in light of. And is this written in sort of the preparation point, which would eventually become the Postcapitalist Desire lectures? Is this sort of where is Mark thinking at this time? Would you think?
I think that's what's really interesting about the book, is that Mark's definitely putting it together around that time in 2016. But a lot of the texts that are in here have antecedents and on the K-Punk blog, some going back, over a decade. I think especially the chapters on Lovecraft, the Fall, the section on the weird, essentially. A lot of that, is sort of refined versions of earlier events and podcasts. I think I'll have to check the date actually, but I know that Mark organised a conference at Goldsmiths University in London on Lovecraft, which partly spawned the opening essay here, but I think also led to Graham Harmon's book on Lovecraft, Weird Realism, and a few other things. But I think in a way, this is Mark threading together, a kind of aesthetic thinking, a cultural thinking that underlines or grounds his entire project. You can date the weird stuff back to the mid 2000s, but a lot of the eerie stuff comes in from Mark's conversations with Justin Barton. Justin Barton's book on Zero Books called Hidden Valleys is an amazing book and really worth checking out alongside this, I think. Justin Barton's best known probably for his... He collaborated with Mark on a couple of audio essays. The first was London Under London, and the second was On Vanishing Land, which was reissued on vinyl and digital by Hyperdub Records, or maybe at least a new sub-label of Hyperdub about a year or two ago. But yeah, so in that sense, it's kind of difficult to pin it down because it really, there's material, despite it being such a brief book, there's material here that covers the entirety of Mark's career as a sort of public thinker.
For listeners, do what I did last Halloween and sit down with On Vanishing Land. It's an incredible experience.
Maybe we should get a little bit better sense of how does the weird differ from the eerie? Adam, I'll just go right back to you with that.
Yeah, so the eerie is... So whereas the weird concerns the presence of something where it should not be. The presence of a something which completely rewrites our epistemological categories of what we think should be in any space or in the space we're thinking of at the time. The eerie is less a question of the sort of things, but sort of it's more oriented around not simply an intrusive presence, but more the dynamic of presence and absence as it relates to a certain kind of failing to be or failing to not be in a space. So Fisher puts into two different categories. So the eerie is either the failure of absence or the failure of presence. So for the failure of absence, an example he gives is The Birds, the Daphne du Maurier novel and the Hitchcock film, but where these sort of really birds should be sort of relatively calm marine animals. They shouldn't have this evil malign intent to go rip everyone's eyes out across the English countryside. Really, there has been a failure of absence here. There is the presence of something suggested that should not have turned up, an evil intent, and this failure of absence leads us to speculate what has joined into the fray. What kind of thing has showed up to do this? Now, on the other side, you have the failure of presence, where something you expect to show up has been occluded, stopped. Then you think, okay, if something has failed to properly show itself, what is the nature of the thing such that this has failed to present itself? So, example of eeriness in this sense, he thinks of stuff like ruins, Stonehenge. If you walk through or even not even Stonehenge, but if you think about a post-apocalyptic Mad Max kind of ruin space, you walk through, Fallout 3, you go through these debilitated, completely blown out schools, and you think, what sort of thing could have done this? It's a question about agency, about why certain things fail to either be there or not be there. And that's why capital is quite an eerie entity, because as Mark says in his Postcapitalist Desire lectures, the entirety of capitalism as a system is not given to you. What's given to you are tasks, forms, jobs, all these things given to you in immediacy. But when you have an eerie experience of what capitalism is, you think, my God, what could have done this? What agency is doing this? Why is this thing not showing up in immediacy? What is preventing this system from showing itself bare to me at this moment? And I think it's about building this kind of eerie experience, but asking yourself, what kind of thing could have done this? What kind of thing could have made you the person that you are? From the standpoint of the eerie, you can actually sort of start to speculate, and then eventually through a sort of understanding the kind of theory that Mark was trying to put forward, grasp the eerie thing, actually complete the sort of speculation. And I think that's why the consciousness raising aspect of what Mark went to do, I think, does sound like it's been very influenced by the eerie. this question of the agency of capital and how it functions in our lives.
Well, as alongside that, it should also be noted that the Eerie plays like a destabilizing role. Right at the end of, I don't remember the chapter, but he brings almost that breakneck shift, almost a breakneck shift in the text. You get this invocation of Louis Althusser, a noted Marxist anti-humanist, and what you get is an assertion that human beings go far beyond just their biological presence. I, as man, woman, person, presenting myself in a space. There's also this sort of eerie failure of absence there, right? All of these things that can be characterized about the individual that aren't tethered to them directly. And in the same way, capital sort of exerts its existence in a manner comparable, because it can produce, as Mark says, Mark Fisher says, practically any kind of effect, but it has no physical presence. It doesn't present itself in the way that the terror of the weird can, the Lovecraftian creature that we cannot truly comprehend because it's outside of our ordered cosmos. So in a sense, it also can destabilize the notions that we have about man, that were never really all that secure before, but only become more obvious when they get directly challenged in this manner.
I'm glad you brought that up, because in preparing for the recent episodes that I did on Proust and Signs, I went back into Descartes. I've been looking at Klosowski recently. One of the things that having Descartes on the brain made me think was that the encounter, what the Eerie constitutes is this kind of encounter that isn't unsettling or a collapse, I think, in some sense, of either fully or quasi-Cartesian notions of the self, insofar as the Cartesian form of doubt gets rewired into a function of being suspicious about the nature of agency of anything, in such a way that we experience the kind of individual dissolution, and here individual refers to a Cartesian individualism. Like you said, Adam, under capitalism, we understand capitalism as this series of seemingly disjointed tasks. And I think one of the ways that we attempt to stabilize ourselves around those series of tasks is through the capitalist notion of the individual, the sort of atomizing notion of it. And I think what happens, that dynamic, at least temporarily, gets inverted when we have an experience or an encounter with the Eerie, such that we can see the intensities that underlie or underpin the functions of capital.
What is the most Eerie notion that has shown up in contemporary philosophy over the past 100 years? It's that whenever we think of the notion of symbols and representation and speech, we think of ourselves as the agents. Well, the entire trace of this from Lacan, to an extent Deleuze, and even Althusser, is that the serious thing is that actually, no, you are not speaking, you are being spoken by the symbolic, which is fully autonomous. And it's if you want to understand it, you have to read the Necronomicon, which is Lacan's decree. And good luck.
The part of the book that stood out to me the most was the section on David Lynch. And as some of the listeners know and some of the Twitter followers know, I'm actually in the movie Inland Empire. And so I was on set with David Lynch for 2 days, and it was an amazing experience. But I think my experiences with David Lynch leading up to that have a significance that's pegged to the analysis that Mark's making here in this book, particularly if we think about the scene from Mulholland Drive, the famous dream sequence behind Winky's Diner. And for those of you who don't know, I don't want it to be a spoiler, but I'll just say this, is that there's a kind of doubling that occurs within that scene where when we think of, and the irony being is, the man who has this dream is meeting with his therapist and he's telling the dream. And I think our expectation as a viewer is that, okay, what comes next? Some sort of analysis some sort of symbolic way of piecing together the intentions with an S, that are in the dream. But instead of getting a representation, we get the lived experience of the dream. So rather than there being a doubling, there's a kind of pairing going on that takes us out of the representational into the actual intensities, right? And whenever I think of this film, or whenever it just sort of involuntarily occurs to me, I just get chills. I think because Lynch has really tapped in to that sort of liminal space that takes us from the representational into the intensive. And here's the interesting thing. I saw that film when I was living in Japan, and it was because of that film I decided to move to Los Angeles. I had nothing going on. I played music and stuff like that. I knew I'd be joining a band, but I thought, hey, I'll get involved with the film industry or something like that. I did, in fact, end up working on music videos and so forth. But the interesting thing is I moved into the West Hollywood area, and my first morning in the city, I decided, now I'll just take a walk right up the street. I walked one fucking block and there was Winkies. Right from Mulholland Drive. It's right there, right? And it's actually a Denny's, or it was a Denny's. I think it closed up like a year or two after I moved in there. But it was just so interesting. And then a week later, my neighbor tells me, he's like, hey, what are you doing on Saturday and Sunday? He's like, David Lynch is filming this film. It's called Inland Empire. Do you want to be in it? And sure enough, I went down to this burlesque bar that's in Hollywood called 40 Deuce, where they have like kind of retro burlesque strippers and, you know, like a whole club scene there. And so if you watch Inland Empire, I'm in that scene. If you know what I look like, I don't have a beard in that scene, but you can find me. I'm standing in the back. Maybe you can screenshot it and throw it on the page and say, hey, is that you? But I'll just say that working on that film was just amazing. David Lynch was great to work with. Every day at either lunch or at the end of the shoot, we would have a debrief, and people would just sort of register their sentiments, like how did they feel about certain scenes. There's actually a scene we filmed that was so amazing, and it wasn't in the actual film. It might be in DVD extras, but
yeah, it'll be alongside those bits, rabbits. It'll be alongside rabbits.
This scene, it was very classic Lynch. It was a woman standing in front of a curtain, and just like in the Fisher book, talking about curtains here. And it was just great, immersed in that environment with all of the production assistants creating the sort of lighting array and, you know, the flickers of light that went across this woman's face. They were playing this kind of very sort of haunting country western tune with a train in the background. And there I am in this like burlesque bar. And it was like the darkest, most rich American experience that one could have. And I know Matt C is going to be very jealous of that because I know that's his vibe.
Oh, it's my favorite film, Lynch film anyway, Inland Empire, for sure. Yeah, I can't even imagine. Oh yeah,
yeah.
I'm just daydreaming live on recording.
I mean, it's so interesting because, like, after reading Deleuze and Guattari's book on Kafka and then reading this chapter on Lynch in The Weird and the Eerie, I got a sense that there's a connection between those two when it comes to just the notion of interpretation. And even in that chapter on Lynch, Mark is talking about, he kind of makes a comment that's very similar to what Deleuze says about interpretation, that there isn't necessarily a wrong interpretation. I mean, there can be where you just don't get the facts right about something. But once you do get most of the facts right, I mean, there are ways that we can take it, you know, and sort of non-representational experiments that we can conduct on the page or in other forms of art that react to that. And for me, it was just very interesting reflecting back how seeing that film triggered something within me that actually took me to the site of the scene that was so profound. And then days later, I'm in a David Lynch film. It's kind of wild looking back at it now.
It was Winkies. It was the porthole at Winkies. That's right. That sort of you just fell into Lynchland.
And here we are in Acid Horizon right now. Right,
this is one long extra.
It's the bottom of the hole.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure how I can follow that, Craig.
That wasn't bad. Well, what about this, Matt C? I'll turn it to you. Like, what are some of the standout moments in A Weird and the Eerie? Like, what are the chapters that you connect with, or what are some books that you've gone into because of that?
Oh gosh, I mean, this book is just so evocative for me on so many levels. Not least because it kind of, I mean, it came out sort of weeks before Mark died, and so we spent most of 2017 reading it, sort of collectively at Goldsmiths, and I think, I mean, the standout discussions from that for me were we kind of read a chapter a week for however many chapters there are. And I think one of the standouts was actually we had a listening session and listened to, what was it called? I never remember the title. I want to get it right. I think it's the Grotesque Album by The Fall.
Yes,
that is one of the that's what it's called, Grotesque. And reading Mark talking about Grotesque after the Gram. The Fall's 1980 album. Reading him talk about it and Marquis' misuse of language, and then just listen to the whole thing straight afterwards was, and it was the heat of summer, I remember too, which in London in 2017 was quite something. I think we totally felt just grotesque, dripping gargoyles. But it was sort of so evocative of a oddly kind of a quintessential English experience almost, which is kind of what I find so striking about this book, in that sense that you have this engagement with Lynch, who, especially as a non-American outsider who's been to the country once and can barely really claim to have much of a cultural sense of what it's actually like to live there, to know a lot of, to get that feeling of American weirdness almost exclusively through a teenager spent watching Lynch, and kind of see these strange resonances with an English eerie and weirdness that's kind of increasingly fetishized in recent years in a way that I think maybe is very different across the pond, but see like the way that Mark just handles both without really much pearl clutching, I suppose, which is quite striking, I think, for him in a way. It's just great to read Mark riffing about things that he just loves, and that there's just this passion here that. I don't know. I feel like it's for such a short book. I feel like I've been reading it again and again ever since it came out, and it's inexhaustible, I think, which is also kind of really striking. Like I can't even pick a single chapter. I just think it's so underrated. But I think that's even in terms of the concepts, that the weird and the eerie in themselves can be kind of understood purely in aesthetic terms, but I think that something that's so underrated and underrepresented in discussion of Mark's work is how important. I mean, this is maybe something too that we can talk about later, but this sense of a cultural prefiguration of what kind of politics does this new sensitivity to the weird and the eerie potentially produce, is kind of one of those huge unanswered questions, I think, that warrants further exploration, I think, in sort of discussions around what Mark was trying to do and did do over the sort of 20 years that he was actively writing.
I'm going to definitely flag that part of the discussion, because I see resonances between what's happening in this book and the notion of acid communism. Like it's pretty apparent to me. But before we go that direction, maybe we'll get Adam and Will's best of moments.
One thing I wanted to touch on, because I've been flipping through the K-Punk anthology once more, and just going through my notes on this text. I remember at one point, Fisher brings up the 2010 BBC adaptation of "Oh Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad," where the main character, sort of in a desperate, angered anguish, states that there's really nothing under the hood for humanity. Man is meat, and meat rots. He's lamenting the fact that his wife has sort of been left in what Fisher describes as a catatonic state by dementia. And I was reminded, because there was a small Twitter discourse. I hate doing this, but there was a small Twitter discourse about sort of the terror of the large work by the caretaker, right? And Fisher spoke extensively about ontology and the caretaker. And one thing that's fascinating about both the eeriness of ontology and of the caretaker is that in this progressive change in the caretaker, the nature of the eeriness changes too. It doesn't just degrade into a low buzzing hum. There's something else also present at the front end of the caretaker project, which is this sort of eerie repetition. The same refrain, leitmotif repeats itself over and over and over again. And all you can remember is that one turn in the ballroom, that one slight alteration in tempo, that short bar of notes, and it's repeated ad infinitum until it slowly starts to fade away. And then what's left is not sort of the failure of absence, but in fact, towards the end of the project, it is the failure of presence.
The chapter on Lovecraft and his notion of the weird as something that can really confront you. You know, the weird is something that confronts you in a way that completely makes your categories useless and really opens up the space for a new conception, a new criterion for what is real and what is possible. And one of the best examples of how he does this is sort of he talks about the way that Lovecraft opens up these different worlds with a sort of really ruthless materialism in which the universe is actually, it's all matter and motion, but this matter is much more eldritch and expansive and weird, than we think. But one of the ways that one of the proofs of which sort of Fisher gives for this, like in an empirical sense, is he talks about how the Necronomicon is never actually really given as a full text by Lovecraft, and it's good that he didn't. Instead, it's only ever cited, and Mark says there's this Lovecraftian work shows the power of the citation. And it's rather amusing because he says, no one has ever gone to the British Library and asked for that copy of Don Quixote that Borges reported seeing. But every day, and I know it's every day because there's like 40 copies of fake ones, but everyone keeps looking for this magical Necronomicon, and people think, is there a Necronomicon? Let's go and see if there's one at the library. It's like the power of the citation to suggest this new world-breaking reality, and I think it's so important for sort of the politics of Mark Fisher, because the weird is a rupturing of the categories of the old. And if we give an example of something that, or at least the possibility of something that breaks with the categories of business ontology, of capitalist realism, then we're already halfway there. But the second point is a bit more personal, I guess, and it's more to do with sort of notion that is throughout this, especially in the section on the stone tape. He talks about how there's this building that's haunted, and throughout the story, people realize that actually it's not really, the ghost doesn't really have much agency. The building itself is an inorganic recording mechanism that traces the human nervous system, and actually the building is the thing doing the speaking. They think, okay, it's just a tape. It's just playing an old recording, an echo. And then the people in said story are forced to reenact the death of the original ghost. And there's a hint that the building is playing them. The symbol is playing them. The inorganic is capitalizing on the organic and using it to its ends. It's this primal nullity that is death that can only ever create life to reinforce itself. And I think this also comes up on the chapter on I believe it's Ghana, where Alphasair is first brought up. And it's the idea that the myth is actually speaking through these people. It has already named them. It has already sort of charted out the symbolic patterns of their lives and emotions they can go through before they're even born. And I think this is just a really fantastic way as well to think about the individual music performance, because you're already writing a musical piece that is already full of influence, regurgitated symbolisms. You're tracing these symbolic lines throughout all of your influences and rejiggling them. But when you're on stage, the persona takes over really, and when I'm on stage doing my power electronics and industrial bullshit, it does feel like, in the sense that I'm just doing a repetition of what's already been recorded. The noise is somehow speaking through me. It's the kenosis aspect of giving yourself over to the symbol, but the symbol has already preordained it. So I think there's a political and a very profound musical dimension to this text.
Let's maybe finish up our discussion with a talk about connecting the weird and the eerie more deeply into Mark's politics. And so this is a time to plug Matt's book on Egress too. I know that Postcapitalist Desire is the most recent text, but Egress was a very important text for me at the beginning of the pandemic. I spent my time walking a baseball diamond at a local park, reading it basically while just walking around wearing a mask. This text in Bataille. One of the things that struck me the most in that book was your mention of Mark's notion of the weird, and the way that you rendered it in the text made it seem as if, okay, here are some implications, albeit minor ones, for how to conduct this as a kind of praxis. I don't know, it just kind of hit me that way. I know it's not exactly written that way, but the question that I have is, does the notion of the weird, or does the notion of the eerie bear with it? Is there the seed of an implication, or the fragment of an implication about how we are to go about a politics that utilizes the weird and the eerie, or maybe it's an aesthetics or a way of doing literature or what have you? How does this connect perhaps to his notion of acid communism? Because I think the one thing that the weird and the eerie and acid communism have in common is the idea that breaking through to the new involves the rupture of the horizon of perception. And maybe that's not all that's involved. So, Matt, I'm curious if you have any reaction to that.
Yeah. I think that one thing that is kind of becoming ever clearer for me personally in thinking about this book is oddly that I don't, in that sense, in a political sense, I don't think it's had its due. I think it's seen as being, a bit of Mark's cultural criticism, but how it sort of furnishes the cultural dimension of his politics is kind of understated. And I actually thought about this recently because I had a bunch of people recommend me a very recent book that's just come out by Sianan Guy, a pronunciation I may be butchering, but her new book called Theory of the Gimmick. And it's an amazing book. It's an absolute doorstopper as well. It's like 500 pages, but she furnishes this. She expands on this theory of the as the title says, this theory of the gimmick, and the gimmick for her is kind of this notion of I think it kind of is essentially what we know a gimmick to be, and she has lots of examples. One that she gives is like a comedy catchphrase. And it's kind of, with at the moment, I can't go online without being bombarded with images for Borat 2. And having this strange echo of Borat's various catchphrases down the years just is kind of epitomizes that in a sense that Borat can say anything. He can say his Yeg Shemesh or his Wah or whatever else. And even if they're kind of meaningless phrases for us to hear, they do a lot of work. They're kind of they're gimmicks that take very little effort to deploy. They're procedural and practical and kind of predictable. But they elicit a response in us, even if, sort of begrudgingly. We can't, maybe we will, unless you were quite maybe strong-willed, we sort of see a chuckle when we see this kind of bizarre caricature fledging around the place. And anyway, and Guy has this, it says that this is essentially what capital does. This is how capital functions in the 21st century, that it functions through gimmicks. It functions through these very quick, easy, aesthetic categories, especially, that take very little time and very little labor to deploy. But someone like a character like Borat can just kind of it becomes wholly profitable just through that kind of a multitude of gimmicks. Anyway, so I think that one thing that I kept thinking about in reading this book of Ungais is that it's kind of the inverse of what Mark's arguing for here. That we have this sense that aesthetically we live in a kind of this smooth world where everything seems to be accounted for and is easily all too recognizable, to the point of sort of a mind-numbing ambivalence. And that's kind of Ngai has that sense that the one thing that the gimmick produces in us is ambivalence. And I think Mark's kind of rebelling against this. And the one example that I think of that is, there's a mix that Mark made. It's one of the final K-pop mixes where he uses the song "Belly of the Beast" by Gazelle Twin on her album Unflesh, and it's this amazing song that it has this kind of horrific first person narrative of being in the belly of the beast, but the song is built around a short sample of the sort of bloops and bleeps that make up the soundscape of a self-service checkout at your local supermarket, and that becomes the sort of the basic sample for this kind of industrial stomper. And I just always thought that was this really inspired use of a kind of really generic sound, but in a way it's that kind of environment where the weird and the eerie is best. It needs to be excavated. And this is probably a very bad joke, but also it's kind of true that, I think everyone's maybe familiar with that, well, especially in the UK, but is familiar with being assaulted by that phrase, unexpected item in the backing area. And just the boring dystopia, as Mark would call it, of these kind of sad robots that don't really function properly, and the weight scales and all this sort of stuff. But what are the ways that there's just another way of defining Mark's sense of the weird? There is something where there's something here doesn't belong. There is something in the backing area that shouldn't be there, but we don't think of that as weird. We approach that failure of this system as just this banal inconvenience. But what if we see these kinds of interruptions, these inconveniences and these mistakes as being far more than that? What if we respond differently than just being ambivalent to these things? And I think it's that kind of, that kind of vigilance and that kind of very, deliberate thinking about how the world is made up around us. I think it did that prefigures what was to come with acid communism. This sense of if capitalist realism is defined by the sense that there is no alternative, and I guess this kind of comes into what you were saying before, Craig, about the Deleuze and Guattari's sense of multiplicity. The great humiliation of Freud being that he can't think multiplicity. He doesn't understand that 6 or 7 wolves is a pack. There's a name for that multiplicity, but he just has to think about things in this this kind of bizarre sense. And I think in a way for Deleuze and Guattari, and also for Mark, that's this kind of weird thinking that's maybe trying too hard, that is actually, but what it kind of says is that there are alternative ways to talk about these things. There are alternative ways to talk about wolves. There are alternative interpretations of that kind of dream. The same applies to capitalism. There are different ways we can talk about this system. There are different ways that we can think about, alternatives to it, be that in the present or the future. And I think it's the weird and the eerie is the easiest way, on the one hand, into that kind of thinking, but also out of our kind of complacency and ambivalence. And in that sense, I think they absolutely are these kind of cultural lubricants that prefigure Marx's vision for an acid communism.
Yeah, that's something that I really have been struggling with in terms of conceptualizing what it means to be a left accelerationist, broadly construed, because, and I recently looked at a little bit of Walter Benjamin and his understanding of the commodity, and how that when objects extricate themselves from being a commodity, that somehow they are more free, right? And, not trapped within the intensities of capital. But what we're talking about, at one level seems like we are moving through the commodity, right? So when we talk about what does acceleration means, well, at one level it means moving through capitalism, and the sort of reconfiguration, for example, of the sample of the supermarket checkout line into this heavy, pulsating industrial music seems to me to be like sort of one of the basic maneuvers that we can do at the aesthetic level to critique the system. The question is, what are the broader implications for that, in terms of organizing and in terms of resisting capital in other ways, right? That maybe just aren't in the dance club, for example, or in some sort of gallery release. Like, how can we sort of pick up that dynamic and transform it into a tactic or into a praxis? But I think, Adam, you wanted to say something too.
Capital has definitely been trying to recuperate the sense in which we can sort of show the weirdness of the supermarket checkout, because if you ever go to some Poundland stores where they have them, they've replaced the very bland, robotic, inhuman-sounding beeps and boops, unexpected items in the bagging area with people like fucking Yoda. So they're already trying to rehumanize it within this gimmick of the recognizable pop cultural Oedipalized kind of face. But yeah, in terms of the politics of the weird and the eerie, I really think that the weirdness is actually quite interesting when you think about it's an amazing example of the self-scan checkout, because the unintended item in the bagging area, it's weird, but it's not weird for you, it's weird for the machine. And what happens is that there's an attendant that comes over and de-weirdifies it for the machine, and you sort of confab even when this weirdness tries to seep out and to think, oh, maybe this is weird, maybe this whole bagging area thing is actually a weird concept. No, you go, oh, actually, you can fabulate a consistency about it. Actually, no, I just did the wrong thing. This whole bagging area is a totally reified bit of kit, and it actually exists. The weirdness is actually prohibited, or it's displaced onto a different agent, which you are taught to assume has a kind of epistemic validity about what categories are actually real in the world, because it's a business ontology. But just to go back to the sort of radical uses of this, I keep thinking of the mapping, the weird and the eerie, Matt. So the concepts you sort of bring up quite a lot in Egress, which is the difference between consciousness raising, RAZING, as in the destructive part, and consciousness raising. And it kind of feels like the weird and the eerie have a very strong part to play in that, because what does the weird do? It takes the categories of your consciousness, and I'm taking consciousness in the Hegelian sense, where it's like there's a criterion for what the object should be, and if you try to stubbornly maintain that when the object doesn't match up, you're just going to get confused and weirded out, and everything's going to change. But the weirdness of the object is something that challenges your categories, and it raises the principles of what you think the object is meant to be, the categories of the object. In that sense, the weirdness is an attempt to raise, in the negative sense, RIZING of your consciousness. But then after that, you have these ruins. You have these ruins of what was there, this ruined object landscape of the capitalist system, of the ontological order of capitalism. And then you can suddenly speculate, what is this thing? The veil is broken. What on earth could have done this? It's almost like, to use a absolutely tired, sort of picture. It's the Matrix, where you go, if you just wake up from the pod after having your consciousness raised, and then suddenly you think, my God, what could have done this? And then the robot shows up, and then you go and blow it up. But yeah,
I think that there's definitely a tie-in to make, and I brought this up earlier, that the Eerie does, in a sense, its primary function is to destabilize via some form of deterritorialization, right? Like sapping the checkout noise from the context within which we all associate it, and placing it within a new one, giving it sort of a new, not necessarily a new facade, but new confines, because the axioms of the medium have changed. So, right, the thing means something here, and it means something completely different there. So in a sense, yeah, there's an element of destruction there, but I do think that done effectively, that doesn't fall back onto cliche or finds itself mediated by an apparatus of capture as strong and significant as one known as strong as the apparatus of capture that capital has at sort of in its in its claws. If it evades cliche, if it evades sort of the limitations that we tend to associate with those forms of art, right, then it can actually raise consciousness in the sort of Lukacian sort of way. So I do think that there's an element of destruction there, but at a certain point, the eeriness of particular things can also bring to the foreground of something its purest, most problematic elements.
Matt, thanks for coming on the show as usual. You're always a great guest to have. This was a great book to go over and at the perfect time in human history to go over it. I'm curious, now after having released Egress and Postcapitalist Desire, the Mark Fisher lectures, what's up next for you in terms of writing projects?
Good question. There's actually too many for me at the moment. I've like bitten off way more than I can chew. I've got a shameful amount of, and a kind of an embarrassing amount of half-finished drafts at the moment that are quite substantial, which is good. But now I'm stuck between not knowing what to finish first. I've got a book on accelerationism that's basically more or less finished. A book on adoption and subjectivity. A book on photography and alienation. And one on the psychedelic legacy of the American West. And I don't know what will finish first, but something along those lines. So we'll see.
All right. When you fly out to the American West, you're going to see me coming up, cowboy hat, speaking French or whatever it is it's going to be.
Yes,
we're
please.
We're going to do our own little Lynchian tableau. Whatever you want, I'll set it up for you.
That's good. Well, that'll most likely be the last one because it's whenever I can afford to get out there and do a tour of from east to west is the big road trip plan. I think I'll have to stop off and see a lot of people on the way. So looking forward to whenever that's possible again.
Yeah, that's good. And I should say one more thing to close out the episode. It's interesting because with all of the Mark Fisher stuff that's been going on since the pandemic begun, I think there's been a more widespread reading of Egress. I know our episodes have influenced readership of Mark Fisher, not to mention the recent release of your book. And now there's just tons of Mark Fisher communities everywhere. He's just memed out to bazoo. That's just the internet for you. So who knows? This is probably going to become a meme too. So
all that is solid melts into memes.